The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
Siege, it's finally over. The Jacob Trouba saga, finally over. He is going from the New York Rangers to the Anaheim Ducks in a trade. And that entire day, following that entire saga, I gotta admit, it was very exhausting. Can we break down this day? Can we break down how we got here? Jacob Trouba wearing an Anaheim Ducks uniform? Let's talk about it.
Sure. I mean, it feels like those World Cup roster announcements for like 2 weeks ago. It's just, we've lived another lifetime of NHL stories since those went in.
Four Nations face-off? What is that?
Right. That feels like that happened a long time ago. I mean, it's pretty unusual for something to play out this way, right? I mean, captains get traded from teams. You know, that does happen. That's not totally unprecedented by any stretch. But the fact that, you know, in this case, Trouba, you know, blocked the trade with his no movement clause in the summertime. It continued to be a discussion point in the season, especially, you know, 10 days, 2 weeks ago when the Rangers circulated a note among the GMs that he was available along with Chris Kreider. And then, you know, basically this final dramatic Friday where, you know, he's threatened with the idea that, you know, at this point he's left with a limited no trade clause and that there's a couple teams on that list of teams that he's blocked that if he doesn't waive for one of them that he might himself end up on waivers. And so it was a pretty dramatic Friday in the end and, you know, pretty cold-blooded piece of business, quite frankly. And look, he's not the only one who can say that this week. We saw Luke Richardson fired by the Chicago Blackhawks. Obviously, Jim Montgomery was fired earlier this month or last month rather in Boston. I mean, cold, hard business is part of pro sports. It's the underbelly of the thing we all get so excited about and love. And so, you know, this is a lot of good things came to Jacob Trouba's life in New York, you know, gets a big contract, becomes a captain there, you know, played on two teams and went to the conference final, won a President's Trophy, had all sorts of personal and professional success, but it didn't end in a very glorious fashion, I would say, for him. And, you know, pretty difficult time. And you almost just hope, quite frankly, that it's a fresh start. You know, once it's all over, that, you know, he and his family can find some new comfort in Southern California.
Okay. How close was Jacob Trouba to actually being on waivers? That's how the day started. Just the idea that the Rangers captain was going to be put on waivers. That is what was believed by many people around the hockey world in the morning leading into the afternoon. How close was that to happening?
Well, I had sources tell me that explicitly on Friday morning that, you know, that waiver period, which starts at 2 Eastern time, he would have been on there if a trade hadn't been done. And, you know, whether or not that was the fact, I mean, certainly the player believed that was the choice before him. The player believed that if he didn't waive his no trade clause for one of the teams that was trying to trade for him, we know Columbus, was trying to strike a deal here. I think Buffalo were among the teams that inquired. I think Ottawa inquired just because obviously there's a need for the Senators on their blue line, but you know, because of Trouba's family situation, remember he left Winnipeg all those years ago, so his wife could keep pursuing her career as a doctor. You know, I don't think Canada was really an option for him just because of his family situation. But you know, there were lots of teams that were knocking around the door here, and so it finally left him with the decision, and he got to a point where, you know, I think in part of his mind he was wondering, like, maybe I don't waive this no trade clause. Like, why would I do anything to help the Rangers in this case? But you know, let's face it, eventually you can imagine how sort of high stakes that is, how emotional that is. You know, eventually if you don't choose where you're going, then you go on the waiver wire. It's just reverse order of standings. You know, Chicago would have had first right of refusal to him right on down the list. And, you know, look, a lot of teams couldn't necessarily take on his $8 million cap hit. I should mention Detroit too. They were a team definitely with interest in Trouba all the way back to last summer, but they are among the teams that would have had to do some cap gymnastics, you know, get players off their cap sheet in order to make the money work on this. And ultimately they couldn't either via trade, but even had he been on waivers, they wouldn't have probably been able to claim him unless they worked out another deal to clear space. And so, you know, it basically, it gave him a certainty versus the uncertain nature of going on waivers and you don't know what's going to happen, where you're going to end up. And so, you know, some comfort there with Anaheim. You know, one thing Trouba mentioned to the reporters when he did his media on Friday night is that, he sees a team that has a lot of good young players, potentially great young players, the way New York was when he first arrived there, and that they could be on the rise over the next number of years. And, I guess it remains to be seen. Will he be part of that picture? Is he just going to be flipped at some point, either before this year's trade deadline or next year's? I mean, it's too soon to say with any certainty how that will unfold. But in the end, I think he was going on waivers. That's just, there's no other way to believe it. It reached a point. I mean, by Friday morning, the Rangers had told him, you're not playing in tonight's game against Pittsburgh. Roster management. We hear that roster management in the 2 weeks before the trade deadline. Usually you don't usually get it for a December 6th game.
No.
But again, this just highlights how unusual this was. It's pretty dramatic, right? With a number of teams, in discussions with the Rangers. And then obviously ultimately, because Trouba did negotiate in his contract that modified no trade clause, he ultimately got to pick among those teams where he went. And, he picked Anaheim from basically he picked Anaheim from the places that he had previously said, I won't go play, because that was a safer pick than going on the waiver wire, where who knows who would have claimed him and how that would have shaken out. Wow.
So when exactly did Anaheim get in the picture for this move to happen? Is there a sense of like a timeline you can provide on that? Like at noon, did they say, oh crap, there's 2 hours before the waiver period, maybe we should get it on this now? Like, when exactly can you pinpoint that?
Well, I think a lot of the talks started to heat up Thursday night, not just with Anaheim, with all the teams involved here. And it's my understanding that the Rangers, went to Trouba and his camp and basically said, here's I don't have the comprehensive list, but here's the 3 or 4 teams where we could, complete a trade for you. Obviously you have this protection in your contract. You've earned the right to choose among those teams about, where you're going to waive to go. And if you don't want to waive for any of those teams, at some point, I think Trouba said by Friday morning, it became you're not playing Friday. Here's the list of teams that you can go to. And then by Friday morning, it became, you're not playing Friday and you're going on waivers if you don't waive for one of them. So, I mean, it was, behind the scenes, I don't know any way to put it other than that's business. I do think, as I mentioned, it's rather cold blooded. It's a rough treatment for, a player that really gives his all, on the ice, who's, bled a lot of blood, sweat a lot of sweat for that organization, who, by all accounts is a super guy. What's kind of weird about this situation, I'd say, Julian, is that it's not totally clear why Trouba became the one that had to go. I mean, obviously internally they identified they needed to change the core, they felt. And, he's only 1 year after this one under contract. I'd say at this stage of his career, not performing up to his $8 million a year cap hit. And, they attempted to move him in the summer, and he, as he said, he chose his family at that point by not taking a trade at that point in time when he still had a full no movement clause. And, but they played pretty rough here. Right. And you wonder what the fallout's going to be in the dressing room. I mean, this is the second veteran player now that, it's gone down in a way that I think other players look around and go like, wow. I mean, Barclay Goodrow in the summer was in a similar spot in that he had a no trade clause and San Jose was on it. They put him on waivers and San Jose claimed him. I think that there's some leftover debris for some of the Rangers veterans in particular about the way that was handled and went down. Trouba was pretty open. I give him credit when he spoke to the reporters that the Ducks set up there that he didn't like the way this was handled, how public it was, how much pressure was applied to him. But he did also say, getting fired by MSG is a rite of passage there.
Such a great quote.
It is. And I got to tell you, I know a lot of people that aren't necessarily hockey players that have worked for MSG that resonated with, because it's a volatile organization. I mean, you look at the top of any team or any organization, every franchise that usually sets a certain tone. And Jim Dolan, it's well documented. It can be emotional, can be very demanding on the people that work for him. And obviously, in this case, the Rangers, they forced their captain out in the middle of the season. I mean, this is a team that won the President's Trophy last year. That was, not that far off winning a Stanley Cup. I realize they didn't like the way they went out against Florida, but Florida went and won the cup. So, I mean, they were in the Final Four, which is usually a good place to be. They've obviously had a fair amount of playoff success without quite getting over the hump. But, it's going to be fascinating to see. I mean, they won the game Friday night over Pittsburgh right after this, amid all this sort of turmoil and chaos. But how the team responds, does this have longer lasting effects? Or maybe, one thing Trouba mentioned I thought was interesting is he found it hard to be a leader this year, wearing the C, because everyone basically knew the team tried to trade him, because that was so public. And so maybe this will remove some, I don't know if you want to call it a distraction, but maybe there's like a feeling around that everyone's looking around. They don't trust what's happening above them. Like maybe this will be something that frees the Rangers in some way. It's hard to know. I can tell you what it does do though. Look at all that cap space they have now too. I mean, they spent some of it. I'm sure we'll get to the Shesterkin extension, but that starts next season. They've got a fair amount of cap space for the rest of this year, and I'm sure they're going to play with it.
We need to discuss the trade itself. Jacob Trouba to Anaheim for Urho Vakanainen.
Sorry, I'm all over the place. There's so many like tentacles to this thing.
Absolutely. But again, the trade itself, Trouba to Anaheim, Urho Vakanainen, and a 4th round pick in 2025. The very first thing on my mind is, how did this deal go down and there was no salary retained at all in this transaction? This went off clean. Why?
I mean, that's what they negotiated. I think because, look, there's a few competing views out there, but I still think Jacob Trouba is a positive value asset in a future trade to Anaheim, especially if Anaheim is willing to retain salary. Like if there's a world down the road, I mean, keep in mind, his cap hit is $8 million. His salary owed next season is $6 million in real dollars. So there's a world next year, for example, where they're trading him again, and he's a $4 million cap hit and a $3 million in actual cash. I mean, when you look at what he does, there's a lot of defensemen around the league that are in that sort of pay band that I think he's better than, frankly. And so, it was maybe a surprising part because you're right. Anaheim theoretically had some leverage here, but the Rangers also had other places they could trade him. So it wasn't like this was the only place. And it's partially a cap dump for sure, but it's a little more than that. I mean, this is still a player that delivers punishing hits, that plays the game a certain way. It's a little bit more of an old school style. Obviously, maybe we're seeing hockey slowly evolve away from, what Jacob Trouba does best. But, I still think he's a player that can give, I think the next trade involving Jacob Trouba was probably going to have a better return. It's just some of the circumstances here clearly dictated, it's not a heavy return in Vakanainen. It's a depth defenseman, that the Rangers are getting back, sort of just protecting them. And, a fourth round pick isn't worth too much. I mean, a 4th round pick, usually we're seeing that traded for, I guess, a 3rd pairing D or something like that at the deadline. So, it's an interesting trade in the return, but, really it's about removing for the Rangers the situation with Trouba and also the $8 million in cap space, because, for a team that's trying to win the cup, that they're in a really unique position right now, that they have that much cap space in season. I mean, they could trade for a $9 million player today and account for it on their cap without having to do any other crazy gymnastics, which, is just not the norm for teams that have the ambitions that New York does this season.
Another thing I keep thinking about with this trade, and I love that you brought up the qualities that Jacob Trouba can bring as an NHL player. It feels like whenever I see Rangers fans talk about him, it's just the opposite. It's just like they don't value some of the qualities that he has. I'm not picking a side in this necessarily, but a lot. I could just, social media is only one side of the story, but I saw a lot of people online who were very happy that Jacob Trouba was no longer a blue shirt. I saw a lot of people who were not happy about it.
And look at that. That might be a fair opinion for those fans that are watching the games. Like, I'm certainly not saying he's a perfect player, but no. I think so much of how players get viewed is the context with their contract, what's expected of them, how they arrive in a situation. I mean, look at Oliver Ekman-Larsson, totally different skill set than Jacob Trouba. But, what I bring him up is he gets a big deal in Arizona. He gets traded to Vancouver, and it's a big deal for the Canucks. They give up a lot of picks in that deal. It doesn't work out. He's bought out within 2 seasons. Then the guy goes, he signs for, 1 year cheap deal in Florida, reinvents himself in a lot of ways. But seen through a different lens. He's not on a huge contract. He was, just someone who was signed on July 1st. If it didn't work out, it didn't work out. And then by the time it gets to last year's free agency, he's getting a 4-year deal in Toronto, and he's been pretty good for the Leafs. So I think sometimes, obviously, it's great to make the big money, and at a certain point, Jacob Trouba earned the contract he signed. But it ends up working against you over time, especially maybe as your skills decline, or people just watch your game a little closer and start to nitpick certain aspects that they don't like about it. And so I just think, I guess my argument was, I'm imagining if Jacob Trouba is traded from Anaheim, meaning if he doesn't play out all of this season and next as a Duck, that it'll be a trade that involves salary tension, and all of a sudden on the next team, he's a $4 million defenseman. Typically, teams are paying $4 million. Ilya Lyubushkin in Dallas is a free agent last year. I think he got $3.25 million, if I'm not mistaken, on his cap hit on a multi-year deal. I mean, teams are paying basically third pairing right Ds about $3 to $4 million, and it's a rising cap environment. And so if you're looking at Jacob Trouba as your third pairing, guy, and his salary is a little bit more in line with where it should be, I think you're judging what he does on the ice totally differently. I mean, he was acquired to be a frontline player, and he was falling down the depth chart there. I mean, the Rangers love Braden Schneider, who they have, right? I mean, Mancini, who they called up in making this deal. I mean, part of making the deal from the Rangers end, there was all the off ice stuff that we've talked about, but it was also, they had players that were ready to pass Trouba by, and this removes him essentially from the lineup picture and gives him a chance to introduce more minutes to other people. So it's a long way of saying, we live in a world where things get sort of taken as black and white, like this guy is no good, but there's a lot of gray in there. And I think in a different, even from Anaheim's perspective, if you're a Ducks, so it's like, okay, he's still an $8 million player, but they didn't give up much to get him. It's a 4th round pick. Like who's mourning that 4th round pick in 2025? Probably nobody in Anaheim. And so, he's basically been given to your team almost for free. So you just view it differently depending on how someone arrives and what they make. And so I'm willing to predict Jacob Trouba is only 30 years old. He might still have a lot of good years left in this league. He's just going to be reframed, and he's going to have to evolve his game, and he will eventually settle in, I think, to a third pairing role down the road. And, he might play until he's 37. Like I wouldn't surprise me at all. It's just, sometimes there's a flip side to getting those big contracts, because it ends up working against you too.
I also think Jacob Trouba deserves a lot of credit for valuing his family, valuing his wife's medical career, and not bending over backwards to just kind of throw that out of whack. And he was very honest about that. I found in him talking about it yesterday. I give him a lot of credit for just kind of putting that first above everything going on. That needs to be mentioned. Yeah.
100%. And the problem is when you're a player, unless you're one of 5 top guys in the league or 10 top guys in the league, the teams have, it's not a pleasant thing to acknowledge, but remember there was a line way back when they were negotiating, and the players don't have a lot of power. It's just the truth. And so, when a team decides they want you out, even when you have these no movement clauses, no trade clauses, this is an example that they can still get you out of there. There's only so much you can do. They can make the environment so untenable where it's just tough to come to work every day, and you say, screw it, I'm gone. And so, I'm with you. I think the other thing about Trouba I should mention is, just from some people that know him well and or spent time around him, they just say he gives everything for the team. This isn't someone who gave up on the Rangers. He didn't get a big deal and just, start mailing it in the summer and whatever. He gave it all for the organization. There's a reason they made him the captain only a few years ago, right? I think he was a captain for 3 seasons. He's still the same person from 3 years ago as now. It's just, it's a vicious sport, and it's an organization that obviously, there's a lot of pressure to win there, and nobody's feeling too good, I don't think, inside that organization right now about it. No one can feel comfortable when you see this. I've seen people opining too, is this going to ruin the reputation? Certainly as a free agent, you might be negotiating a little harder to get a no movement clause if you're going to sign there, especially if you have some leverage and you have some options. But let's face it, the Rangers are always going to be the Rangers. There's going to be a luster to that organization. they're known for doing everything, first class in terms of just how they travel, how they live, how they make, things available to the players. There's only one team where you can play at Madison Square Garden every, 41 nights a year. There's only one team where you can really truly live in Manhattan if that's what you want to do and play for them. I guess you could reverse commute to Newark or something if you were a Devil. But I mean, by all intents and purposes, the Rangers are a pretty special organization around the league. And so I still think they're going to be a destination even after all this. And, there's lots of grumbling maybe about how they've treated certain players. I mean, they're also a team that could win the cup still. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen out of the strange scenario that's been created here over the last few months, but just on paper, they have a team that was the best in the regular season last year, and I don't see a big fall off from where they are now. And frankly, I don't know where they're going to spend all that cap space I mentioned, but they've got a lot of things they could do. I know they're trying to acquire a Brady Tkachuk out of your backyard there, apparently, but that's a one-way.
We're going to bring him up.
That's a one-way conversation. It sounds like the Rangers might want him, but I don't think Ottawa's taking those phone calls and indulging them back.
Yeah, we both learned from our sources yesterday that no Tkachuk to the Rangers. That's not happening, as far as we know.
No, and I think, look, a lot of people are talking about Brady. He's such a competitive guy. He wants to be in the playoffs. And I do think there's a pressure. I mean, look, there's pressure not because Brady Tkachuk's in Ottawa. There's pressure because the Senators haven't been in the playoffs in a long time. So, and they've got a new ownership and they've invested more in the team and the organization and the franchise. There's pressure on everyone in Ottawa to get back to the playoffs and to take steps with that team. But I think with someone like Brady Tkachuk, you wonder how long would it be that he can exist there if they don't take those steps. And so I don't think it's certainly right now. I have no impression at all. In fact, I know the opposite. Brady Tkachuk's happy being a Senator and wants to be there. But, it's not hard to connect the dots over time if the organization flounders and he's another 2 years down the road and they haven't played those playoff games. He's seeing his brother playing every year. He's going to be tired of being the brother who's got to travel to Calgary or Florida every spring to watch a Tkachuk at a playoff game. He wants to be playing them himself. So, I think we can put that one to the side now. I love Ian Mendez coming off the top rope there, though, with the thesaurus.com tweet. If you didn't see it and you don't understand the dynamics, it's hard to explain here, but it was a pretty funny tweet from our former colleague at The Athletic.
I just want to mention two things about Brady Tkachuk, because the fact that became a rumor on Friday feels like it's been the culmination of something weird that's been happening in this market for the last week or two. There was like a stretch of games where the Sens weren't playing that well, and people were looking at Brady Tkachuk's leadership, and somehow the discourse turned into, well, he's probably going to get traded. I don't know how that got to that point. I don't think it ever should have gotten to that point. And I'll add to that and say, when the Senators eventually make the playoffs, they're going to need a guy like Brady Tkachuk. And if they move on from that guy, I really think it would be a mistake, considering the fact that he can play heavy hockey, he can go into the dirty areas. That's a player that this team would need in that situation. So I don't see them. I don't see them rushing to.
And you're there every day. Like, my impression from afar is the Sens appreciate everything about Brady. Like, it's not like the team doesn't value this. All of it is coming from the outside. It's not because on the inside, the Senators are looking at Brady Tkachuk and going, yeah, do you know what? He might not be the leader we need. Like, I think that they love the guy. Like, my impression is I've gotten
that impression too.
Right. They have zero intention on trading him. It's really more about can they keep him happy over time, right? As he gets closer and closer to being a UFA down the road, as he gets deeper into his career, if they're not having that success, like, I think it is natural to wonder maybe he's going to look around and go like, this isn't it for me. But by no means are we at that point, and is my understanding from his end of it, and certainly from their end of it. They love him. I can understand why teams around the league are looking and going like, whoa, if we could get Brady Tkachuk, that could be a game changer. I mean, he would the fit in New York, and now with like the cap space, everything, it is perfect. Like, I'm not denying from the Rangers end of this, if you could just make trades by yourself and say, hey, I'm going to pick a random guy off a random team. I think it would make a whole lot of sense for them to drop Brady Tkachuk into their locker room and into their lineup. They might actually slap the C on him right now if they actually did that. But the point is that's just not happening. And let's veer back away from fantasy hockey for the next little bit here, because I don't want to radio myself.
That's very fair. Let's not get you radioed. But we had to mention that because like in the middle of all that Trouba stuff, like that story ended up being a thing for like an hour, and we had to deal with that, and then go back to Jacob Trouba and wondering what his future was going to be. And then after
it was a fun day. I got to say,
it was a fun day.
I enjoy this stuff. I mean, it was a great week. I love the whole roster stuff with the Four Nations. I mean, just there's a lot circulating. Like I've been saying this for a month or more on our pod though, like that it feels like there's more action early in this season than we typically see. And there's just so many teams where the tension is just rising. And there's a lot of those teams are just talking to each other about trades. And we've already seen the 6th overall pick dealt in the David Juracek deal. Now you got Trouba being dealt, the New York Rangers captain after being in the Eastern Conference final last year.
3rd captain in a row to get moved on from, by the way.
Right.
Ryan Callahan, Ryan McDonough, and now Jacob Trouba.
There you go. And then, we've had some smaller stuff. Like this has like I feel like it's going to keep going is kind of the point. I do feel as though it's not like all the pressure relief valves have been hit. We've only got, less than 2 weeks until the holiday roster freeze kicks in on December 20th. But I could still see more. I could still see more action coming down before then.
So Jacob Trouba, the Brady Tkachuk story. And then after all that, Igor Shesterkin signs $11.5 million AAV on an 8-year deal. It's just all that happening all yesterday. Just all that happening. Like, holy shit, what a day. Talk to us about the Igor Shesterkin deal.
Well, I mean, it's the richest contract in history for an NHL goaltender. If you go by percentage of salary cap, it actually isn't the number one, but in terms of, pure dollars in his bank account, no one has made more than the $10.5 million that Carey Price had been taking in Montreal, and actually still is, even though he's injured and unable to fulfill the rest of that contract. But it's a big deal. It's sort of what we expected. I mean, remember the season started with all this talk. I mean, there was a push, pretty strong push by the Rangers to get him signed right at the start of this regular season or in the early days, and they got to a point with their offer where they were above the $10.5 million. Where Price was, something in the $11 million range. He ends up getting it up to $11.5 million. And, I think it makes sense. I mean, look, we live in this world where most teams aren't spending a lot on their goaltending. They're certainly not looking to. But if you're going to spend on someone, I think it's Shesterkin. I mean, to me, he's clearly been the MVP of this team. The unspoken part of when we're talking about all that the Rangers have accomplished in these past few years with playoff runs and the like, they've done it by kind of going against what you'd expect. Like they're not a team that's dominated puck possession. They're not a team that's controlled play. I mean, they've relied on having a backbone like Shesterkin to have those runs and then finding some timely goals. But there haven't been a dominant on ice team in front of him. I think that he's papered over some cracks or allowed them to become an even better version of themselves. And so that's how you get to the point where you're willing to give him that deal. And so I'm really not surprised. Like I always felt like it was going to end up here because as valuable as he is, and as much as teams around the league would love him, like had he gone to free agency, just again, we'll open the fantasy hockey door.
And we're back.
How many good teams or desirable locations could pay him something in this neighborhood? I just don't think, like, for all the teams that would look at him and be like, do you know what? He would be a clear upgrade on our goaltending. But can we pay him $12 million on a 7-year deal to even get him close to the ballpark of this contract? And that wouldn't even get you all the way there. A 7-year deal times 12 is $84 million. You got $92 million over 8 years. You're still $8 million shy. And so I thought it always made the most sense. He loves playing there. You have so much proof of concept, right? You know that he can handle everything it is to be a Ranger. Amid all this chaos, it's Shesterkin making a couple big saves. They win that game on Friday against the Penguins. I mean, you just know that he's the right player at the right time there. And what a stretch that they've had to go from having Henrik Lundqvist as long as they did, and then essentially going into this era with Shesterkin, and he's going to be their goaltender, perhaps for 13, 14 years, whatever it ends up being, 15 years. We'll see how it all plays out. I mean, it's pretty unusual to have that kind of stability with a top flight goaltender. And when you have that, why would you let that go? I mean, how many teams around the league, look at Colorado's probably the easiest example to cherry pick from, but how many really good teams around the league are you looking at them going like, but I don't know if the goaltending is going to hold up. And and there's a lot of maybes because of that. Like that you could have an otherwise amazing team. You know, the Rangers have a sure thing in this guy, and so it's another big deal. I mean, we're seeing now the top players, like the cap hasn't yet shot up, but it's like almost like the expected place where it's going has driven all these contracts up. So you saw the Draisaitl deal end up at $14 million. You know, I think it's part of the tension built into the Mikko Rantanen situation in Colorado, Mitch Marner in Toronto. Some of the big, you know, players that could hit free agency on July 1st, they're asking for more than what they would have been paid in the past because they're like, look where things are going. I mean, haven't even got to where Kirill Kaprizov or Connor McDavid end up on their next deals. You know, we're seeing a sharp uptick, I think. We're in this era where the very top players are getting paid, and Shesterkin continues that early trend that maybe isn't fully a trend yet, but it's certainly trending in that direction.
I think I know the answer to this question, but did the Jacob Trouba move facilitate this contract extension talk? Like, those two seem like two different contracts kind of going through their own thing. I don't think one necessarily had to lead to the other, but am I wrong in that?
Well, I think getting the full $8 million off the books for next season made it easier for the Rangers to get a little higher on the contract. So it's obviously directly related on some level because the same day one is traded, the other is agreeing to terms on his deal. So, you know, there is some causation there. It's not though that Shesterkin said, I'm only signing if Trouba's off the team. To be clear, right. It's more from a salary cap management standpoint. Once they knew for sure that they were losing all of Trouba's $8 million for next year, I think it was easier to pay him to pay Shesterkin a little bit more than they were originally inclined because, you know, they got the Lafreniere deal done earlier this season, which kicks in next year. I mean, there is a lot of moving parts and they still have a couple of UFAs on that roster that have to be taken care of or decisions have to be made. It's a time of transition for the Rangers. But, you know, I do think that they're somewhat related, but also I always just kind of felt this was going to find a way to get done.
Okay. So Jacob Trouba, Brady Tkachuk, Igor Shesterkin. There's one more Rangers question I have for you, and then we can move out of Manhattan and we can go to Central New York.
I love that we did like half hour on the Rangers. Like,
yeah.
What a soap opera.
I was about to say, like, nothing, it's never dull in the Big Apple. So where does this all leave Chris Kreider? Where does this all leave the other big name that was rumored to be in trade talks? I
think he's probably safe, but
really, I
mean, it depends. Look, it depends where the offers come. You know, if I think that they're certainly in a position where they were among the players they mentioned in that memo. Those two were highlighted as possibilities because they're, you know, usually a team isn't going to move off its longest tenured player or its captain. Like usually those players aren't really in trade talks, right? So I think they were highlighted, but it wasn't like both had to go. And so, you know, we'll see how things develop. We'll see how he plays. I mean, he was named to the U.S. Four Nations roster last week. And so I do think that there's an opportunity for him to just keep moving on, but I don't think they have to trade him is the easiest way to put it. They've now created the cap space even for the rest of this season, where there's a lot of different things they can look at and do. And so, you know, I wouldn't look at no one's safe is the best way to put it. Who is safe? I mean, Igor Shesterkin is safe. Maybe Alexis Lafreniere with the new 7-year extension that starts next year. But for the most part, very few players on that roster I would call even vaguely untouchable. So, you know, it's hard to predict, but I do think that it's not as though they have to move him. And if you're doing so, they'd have to get something of real value back. I still think Kreider, it hasn't been his best season. He's still scoring some goals. The assists haven't been there. It's just been, you know, a bit more of a struggle than some of the previous years. But, you know, his contract isn't that, especially in a rising cap environment, it's not that untenable. And so if they're trading him, it's because they're getting something back. I don't think it's a straight salary cap dump or anything like that. But we'll see. I mean, I wouldn't have called all this that we've just seen play out over the last week or so here. And so my sense is they don't have to move him, but I mean, it's there's still room to be surprised.
I feel like we're going to get back to the New York Rangers at some point. I don't know, maybe just to check in. But that is a lot that we've spoken about when it comes to the New York Rangers. Hey, everyone. I'm Julian McKenzie, and Chris Johnston has decided to join me to talk to you guys about why Mint Mobile is so great. Thanks to Ryan Reynolds for Mint Mobile, by the way. We really appreciate you, buddy. Friends don't let friends overpay for wireless. I think that's pretty true. Isn't that right, CJ?
Yeah, I would never let a friend overpay for wireless, especially when Mint Mobile is offering premium services starting at $15 a month.
Oh, come on, like that's such a good deal. And all their plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You could use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your own phone number along with all of your existing contacts. Like it just makes perfect sense.
$15, you can't even get a beer for that at an NHL game.
That needs to change. But that's a whole other ad in itself. Ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. And if you want to take advantage of this customer offer in your new 3-month premium wireless plan for $15 a month, mintmobile.com/Johnston. CJ, your last name is not that hard to spell.
Johnston. Get on Mint Mobile.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode of The Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by Storyworth. If you're spending time with your loved ones for the holidays, chances are you're going to hear a lot of stories, and Storyworth is really good at preserving them and making them look really, really good. CJ, how does this work?
Well, you just send one question per week. Storyworth will do that for you. You get a chance to dictate what it's going to be. Maybe what's the furthest you've traveled? What's the bravest thing you've done? What's the weirdest thing you've ever eaten? And your family member just answers that question, and it gets all compiled together at the end of a year. Pretty cool way to sum up their life. Basically,
like, take the energy you give in our Ask CJ questions every week and just put it towards what you would put in for Storyworth. They make the process a breeze with writing. All your loved one needs to do is respond to that email with a story, long or short, it does not matter, and you'll be emailed a copy of your loved one's response as they're submitted over the course of the year. Families love Storyworth. That's why it has more than 35,000 5-star reviews on Trustpilot, with millions of stories preserved since they were founded over 10 years ago. Help your family members share and capture their stories this holiday season with Storyworth. Go to storyworth.com/
Johnston.
I want to talk about the Buffalo Sabres next. Kevyn Adams, the GM over there, just had his press conference with the media. Couple quotes going around. I hear they don't have palm trees out in Buffalo, by the way. That seems to be one fun quote that's gone out of there, but also another big one here. We're not a destination city right now when you're going to be able to go out and get UFAs that are key guys. And I just don't think that's a way to build a sustainable winner. Very interesting comments from Kevyn Adams out in Buffalo. What did you make of his press conference?
He sounded frustrated, right? I mean, that's what it sounds like to me when you read those. And you know, I'm going to borrow a little bit from the column of our colleague Matthew Fairburn, who did a really nice job, I think, sort of summing up that availability. But it's not that they're not a destination city. It's that they're not a destination franchise, which is an important distinction, because there is definitely a world. There's been a world in the past where I think that Buffalo has been a destination in the hockey world. And I think there could be a future world where, if they're, you know, got a chance to win a Stanley Cup, I mean, it's a great place to live and raise a family. It's a much easier pace of life than some of the other bigger cities around the league. It, you know, has as passionate a fan base as you could hope for, especially when times are good. And, you know, if the Pagulas are building out the right things around the team, like I think it could be in its own way a destination. Yes, I know it snows in the wintertime and you have to pay taxes in New York State, and there are no palm trees, but that sums up a lot of places around the league, quite honestly. And so, you know, I won't say that he's making excuses, but I think he just sounded to me, when I watched that press conference, he looked exasperated by the situation a little bit. And look, they're 13 years without the playoffs. So I think exasperation is I think that's a fair emotion or feeling for anyone to have who cares about the Sabres. And, you know, obviously their general manager, Kevyn Adams, played for the team. He's from the area. Like I don't question his level of care and probably at times despair about where they've got to, you know, especially when you look at it's gotta be hard that you had players that became key members of cup teams. Like Sam Reinhart drafted and played in Buffalo. Jack Eichel drafted and played in Buffalo. Ryan O'Reilly signed a big deal in Buffalo, went and won a cup with St. Louis and is a valued member of lots of really good teams since, and Reinhart played a big deal in Florida's cup win last year. Obviously Eichel could have won the Conn Smythe Trophy a couple seasons ago when Vegas won the Stanley Cup. And so you've had the guys have been in your possession that you've seen it afterwards. It's just, they haven't been able to get it right there. And so, the Sabres are at that point. And I remember when I first was on the Leafs beat, Julian, it was when they had that window where they didn't make the playoffs for a long time. And so this is where it gets tricky, is every time the team loses 3 games in a row in a given season, it becomes a whole referendum on everything that's happened for a decade and everything that's gone wrong. I mean, that's what they're managing in Buffalo. And because the truth is, the Sabres are right there knocking at a playoff spot. They were in a playoff spot 2 weeks ago, and then they've gone through a dip here, and they make Kevyn Adams available to the media. They requested him, and then everything becomes about it's like existential dread, enters the conversation, when really it's like, okay, look, we lost 3 games. I'm not making apologies for the Sabres. Certainly, I think they're going to be tooth and nail to get into the playoffs, but it's at least possible. Very interesting comments, and Kevyn Adams is in his 5th year as GM. I think he is. We talked about Lou Lamoriello in the last episode being under some pressure and maybe in a tough spot with the Islanders. I think Kevyn Adams is in a similar spot where they need to take a step. They need, for him and for belief in his plan. They're eventually you just have to win enough games. I mean, enough becomes enough. And unfortunately for Kevyn, who I think actually has done some good things in Buffalo, like that's, when you have a press conference like that and you give a quote that everyone remembers, like that palm tree quote is going to be coming up in a year. It's kind of what, it's sort of what happens though, right? When I saw it again, it reminds me a lot of those early days in Toronto. Brian Burke would say something at a press conference back when he was a GM about the state of the team, and it would just get brought up on radio in columns for like the next 18 months that he said this about the team. And I just feel like that palm tree quote. I already saw a fan had the old Sabres sweater, and instead of the Sabres, they put palm trees over.
That was a great meme you posted in the group chat. Yeah, by the way. That was really funny.
I mean, look, it's a great passionate hockey city. I think I've been open on this pod that I love going to Buffalo for games. I think it really has the potential. I mean, look at the Bills right now. The Bills are a sensation in the NFL. They're getting lots of players that want to play there, top players. I mean, obviously every individual has their own, decisions when they're a free agent or when they control where they can wind up. And some people might be weather. Like some people that might be the number one thing, or the tax issue might be their main driver. But I think most players want a chance to win the Stanley Cup. Like ultimately that matters. And if the Sabres show they have a chance to win a Stanley Cup year in and year out, I don't think we're going to be talking about guys with no trade clauses. I mean, look at Buffalo tried very hard last summer to get Marty Necas when he was available out of Carolina. I think that there might have been a wink, wink, nudge, nudge that's kind of who Adams was talking about a little bit, but we're on a lot of no trade lists. Obviously Necas has had just a fantastic start with the Hurricanes this year, right up among the scoring leaders in the entire NHL. So that's one of those trades you won for Carolina, just not by making it. But that being said, I don't think we'll be talking about all of these players not wanting to play in Buffalo once the Sabres show that they're a franchise that's seriously in the competition to win the silver thing.
I was going to bring up earlier how Jack Eichel and Sam Reinhart, as we're recording, are in the top 5 in scoring. Ooh. And then you mentioned the Marty Necas thing. That just makes it even more painful because he leads as of now recording, he leads everyone in scoring. So if you're a Buffalo Sabres fan, you look at that top 5, you would pull your hair out. Oh my God. That's so frustrating for these guys.
Well, and they
had the players. They drafted guys like Eichel and Reinhart, as you mentioned, Casey Middlestat, who ended up getting offloaded for Bowen Byram, Rasmus Dahlin, Owen Power. They have the players. It just doesn't work.
Well,
and it's been that way for over a
decade. They might not have enough of the players. Like I look at their roster now, especially up front, and it feels to me like they're an impact forward short. And, and they have really good players, but did they have, like, they're in a tough division, like Tage Thompson, I know he had the big year a couple years ago. He's had a much better season again this year. But like, is he their best forward, or is it a Dylan Cousins, or like they have really good players, but like they're maybe not on the level of what they're seeing every night when they go into Tampa and they're going up against Kucherov and Point, or Florida with the aforementioned Sam Reinhart, Barkov, Matthews when they go down to Toronto. Like it's a tough division, and I think that they don't quite have the high end quality and maybe quite the quantity. But I'm with you. I don't think they're far off. To me, it looks like a team. I think where some frustration comes in too. They're not spending to the cap. And it's been a couple years in a row now where they haven't spent to the cap. And one of the areas where Kevyn Adams kind of bristled at the questions was, about ownership's commitment and all those sorts of things. So I think that's another element of frustration is maybe they're leaving a little on the table here where there's an opportunity for them to be better than they are. And they just haven't quite, they don't have full buy-in from an organizational standpoint to do that.
Have we exhausted all that we can exhaust from the state of New York? Yeah,
the state of New York, something's in the water right now.
Clearly. We can go to Chicago then. Luke Richardson, no longer the head coach. Anders Sorensen taking over in the interim. We knew Chicago wasn't going to be that good this year, but why is Luke Richardson out?
Well, they're last place in the league. And so you're right that maybe we didn't expect them to be a playoff team this season, but they expected to be further ahead than where they are. And, in particular, it's turned in the last couple of weeks for them. And, Luke Richardson was in the third year of a 3-year deal with a team option for a fourth. But, he was in a vulnerable position if the team didn't take that step. And, you saw Kyle Davidson got a little emotional in talking about, having to fire Luke Richardson, who was, one of his first big decisions when he took over as a general manager. But it almost felt like time. I mean, I hate to be that person, but I think we might be sleeping on how do I put this the best? Like on how alarming the situation could be in Chicago. I had another executive tell me this maybe 18 months ago. Like, it's great that Chicago won the rights to draft Bedard, but the timing's all wrong. Like getting him, they're not ready to have that player yet. And they're not going to be able to build a good enough team, when he's in his cheaper years on an entry level deal. And that just at the time, I remember thinking like, oh, I didn't think of it that way, but they were almost like it was too soon in the rebuild you can't pick these things, of course, right? I mean, it's not like they were going to give the pick back or trade it away, but they weren't maybe ready. They weren't on the upswing at all yet. They were still going down when they added him. And I think Connor Bedard's season, I'm not blaming him for the firing of Luke Richardson by any means, but the fact that he hasn't taken a step and in fact has been very hard on himself publicly. You went through a long goalless drought and talked about how he was doing 100 things wrong, if I'm being honest. And, I think it's been a hard time for him. And so the first, maybe to frame it a different way, the first priority for Anders Sorensen as the interim head coach has got to be doing whatever he can to make the environment as great as he can for Connor Bedard. And, I think one area that Chicago's looking at specific to Bedard is that he's not been in a position to create off the rush as much. And, obviously he's not a big guy. Like when the puck's on his stick, he's as dangerous as the most dangerous players in the world, but he's obviously not someone you're expecting at this stage of his career anyway to be playing a cycle game in the offensive zone. I mean, where he's dangerous is if he's entering the zone with possession and getting off that crazy shot or having a teammate enter that way. And so I think you'll see some changes in the early going here, just designed around giving him a better opportunity to attack kind of with some speed and not necessarily playing a, dump and chase, grind it out kind of game. Because I just don't know that is the best way to basically use the skills he has and the special skills he has. And so Luke Richardson's fired because the Blackhawks didn't take a step. But I think that organization, we maybe are not paying close enough attention to how dire it could get if they don't find a way to start taking those steps. Mark Lazarus mentioned in his column about how it's almost impossible to get Blackhawks games on TV locally because there's, I don't understand all the media side of that, but like that they're almost out of sight, out of mind. And let's face it, I think Luke Richardson right now is fired because either they made the wrong choices in free agency last summer or he wasn't getting enough out of those players. But, from Tyler Bertuzzi, Teuvo Teravainen, TJ Brody in particular, the players they spent a fair bit of money on, they're not getting anything, honestly. I mean, it's been, those guys, you look at the production, it's just not there. And, I think at a certain point, we got to start asking questions about the front office. I don't know if that that point is today. Because obviously they've accumulated a lot of young players. Frank Nazar, one of their recent first round picks, has had a really good season in the American Hockey League. There's probably going to be mounting pressure to bring him up at some point here to get him a regular run in the NHL this season. There's lots of reason, I guess, for longer term hope, but it's not been a very good couple months in Chicago.
That is there's so much to unpack from that. But one particular thing I want to ask is just the thinking of the fact that Chicago might have gotten Connor Bedard at the wrong time. Like, that kind of breaks my brain a little bit. Like when is the right time to get a potential franchise changing number 1 overall pick? Like, obviously when you need them, right? But just, it's interesting that it's been phrased that way.
Well, they did it while trading other young, really good players. Like Brandon Hagel was on the Chicago Blackhawks. And I think they traded him for 2 first-round picks, if I'm not mistaken, amongst, some other things. But they got a good return for him, but he was 23 when they were trading him. And now he's playing for Team Canada at the Four Nations. And, so they were trading away those players. They traded away DeBrincat, right? And, basically they were still stripping it down, and they didn't have enough good players around Bedard to be ready to do anything, right? I mean, they were a laughing stock last year. They're above that now. But they're still at the bottom of the standings. Any way you look at it, maybe, they're losing with a little more pride this year. They're not getting totally embarrassed, but it's a tough league to win in, right? And so the truth is this is just one person's opinion that I'm sharing. I'm not saying that this is a fact. But there was a feeling out there among people that really pay attention to roster building and know a lot about the league that maybe it just wasn't the ideal time because they weren't even ready to start building it. They didn't have enough players in place. And then all of a sudden you've got Bedard and look, you can see the strain on him. I mean, they can't seem to find the right line mates for him. He's been moved to the wing a little bit of times this year. I know he had a lot of success last year playing with Philip Kurashev, and they keep trying to reunite those guys, but Kurashev's among the players that have had a really tough start to this season. It's a tough league. I actually don't. I should be clear on this too. I don't yet worry about Bedard. I think it would be way too soon to say this was a bad pick. I frankly, I just have no time for that talk because when you step away from it all, he's still the second youngest player in the league right now, and he's a little under a point per game for his career. But it's not like he can't play. He hasn't dominated maybe as much as I would have, or I was predicting. In fact, I remember thinking he was going to step in the league and be making more of an impact, on day one than has actually been the case. But, I still think there's a lot of room for patience here and, with him specifically, but it's, I don't know what the next years look like in Chicago. I was in Prague last year in May. Connor came and played for Team Canada there. And he was pretty open in a couple of the back and forths we had just about how frustrating it was to be on a team that was losing like Chicago was. And so this is the second year now where that's happening. I mean, we'll see. Anders Sorensen, he's just fresh in this job. Maybe, he had success with some of the younger players because he was down in Rockford in their AHL team. Maybe he can turn things around and get them winning a little bit more and this will change. But if, let's say, this year just kind of plays out the way the first couple months have, that's going to be the second year. And you just feel like Bedard wears that heavy. It's just tough for any young player to develop. I think it's even tougher to develop when you have the sort of spotlight he has, when he gets the attention he does from other players, the media, the fans, and the organization just seems adrift. So, a move like this is made to try to reverse course on some of those things to get a fresh, not just face, but new ideas into the dressing room, into the tactics that they're playing with, into, how they're dealing with Bedard, right? I mean, the coach was one of the main people in the organization talking to him every day. So, we'll see if that can change, but it's tough times there. And I don't think by any stretch, no one looks at that and says Luke Richardson's at fault, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and he wasn't getting enough out of the team to keep working.
One more team near the bottom of the standings that I want to get to before we wrap up today, the Nashville Predators. You get the sense that Barry Trotz is itching to do something else. We've already seen him make moves, thinking of guys like Dante Fabro being put on waivers or Philip Tomasino getting dealt to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Andrew Burnett's job what's next for him? What's next for the Nashville Predators?
Well, I mean, Andrew Burnett guided the team to the playoffs last year, and I think that's worth something. I mean, remember as well when he was the head coach in Florida, he took over when Joel Quenneville stepped aside, and that team had a great run. He didn't end up getting the full-time job that went to Paul Maurice, but he's had success as an NHL head coach. I think he's still viewed as pretty young relative to his peers, up-and-coming coach in the league. And so as much as I understand why those questions are being asked, because it's been, really difficult start for the Predators. I don't think his job's in danger. I've seen a lot of people speculate, Barry Trotz, who's had all the success as a head coach, he can just go behind the bench. Like I don't think at this stage of Barry's career that he has any interest in doing that. Even in a short-term kind of situation, like I just don't see that happening. What I do see happening though is mounting pressure on Barry in the front office to keep making changes to this team. I think it's a little bit like, it's akin to Pittsburgh. They're in a different spot for a different reason, but I think Pittsburgh, remains pretty aggressive and looking for ways to improve the team on the fly. It's not a cut and paste normal season. Like I think they're open to all kinds of stuff. I think that's where Nashville's going to get to. Barry Trotz gave an interview locally in Nashville last week where he mentioned Christmas. He was basically going to give the team no Christmas and then have that dictate what he says. Since he's said that, they've gone and lost a couple games on their Eastern Canada road trip. So, it doesn't look good for this season. I think it's going to be hard for them to salvage much. So, I think where we're at with Nashville is they're a little stuck, but I think they're going to keep being pretty aggressive and trying to make some changes to the roster and, make some space maybe for some younger players they have in the American Hockey League to come up. And, this is not how anyone saw it though. I mean, they played a game in Toronto last week and I was in their room and just, you almost sense a little disbelief from the guys, you know what I mean? And, they're not hiding from it. Like I didn't see any excuses being made or hear any excuses being made, but they're looking for answers too. And, so far we don't have them. So I'd say we talked about a lot of teams that are taking action right now. Nashville isn't quite in action mode, but it's coming if they don't, if something doesn't change. And I don't see what's going to change right now. They're not deep enough down the middle. They're not scoring enough goals. It's not what we would have expected as the problem, but that's been the problem.
I saw some comments float around on social media from Jonathan Marchessault. He was getting interviewed by Jeff Chaumont from the LNH.com website. I'll just read this quote here. Every shift I go out there and think about who I'm going to get on the ice with. I had a line in warm-up, and I started the game with a bunch of guys. I changed lines about 3 times tonight. And that's a portion of what he said in the interview. You can find that online. But to me, that sounds kind of weird. Like I get it. You're all professionals. You find ways to make it work with everybody. But for him to be in that situation, especially as a new guy in that market, I think that's a bit interesting.
Well, it is interesting. And, Nashville chose to sign 2 higher end wingers last free agent period, but they don't have enough centers. I mean, there's no way around that. Ryan O'Reilly is a top line center. He had a great year last year playing with Philip Forsberg and Gustav Nyquist. Nyquist, even into his 30s, had a fantastic season. So they were a good top line. But the problem is down the middle, like their other centers are like Tommy Novak, Colton Sissons, like just guys I don't think are well suited as a second line center. So if we want to nitpick or second guess, maybe instead of Jonathan Marchessault, they should have went and signed Chandler Stevenson, for example, his old teammate from Vegas, who I know Nashville did have some discussions with. Stevenson goes to Seattle instead. But, maybe that would have made more sense because then you're adding Stamkos at this point in his career as a winger, and you might have had better balance. I think with Marchessault, you're right. It sounds weird. I should say this too. Marchessault is among the most honest NHL players I've dealt with in my entire career. Like that guy calls it as it is. He doesn't, he's not afraid to meet a difficult discussion with an honest answer. And so I respect that about him. I think he's just giving an honest answer to JF Chaumont. But the reason the lines are changing so much is nothing's working. They don't have enough centers. They have too many wingers and not enough centers to find the balance to create maybe the sort of consistent attack they need. And they're not scoring goals. So what does every coach do when they're not seeing their team score goals? They shake up the forward lines predominantly. And that's what's happening, maybe a little too much for Marchessault's liking in Nashville, but it's hard to really argue against why you do that in Andrew Burnett's shoes, because I think he's probably looking up at the press box going like, really guys, like I need some different pieces here. And it's hard to trade for an impact center at this stage of the season. We know Calgary would like to do that. There's some other teams that are in that market, but there's just not enough really good centermen that are available at this point in time. Forget even the acquisition costs. Those players just aren't even available full stop. And so that's why I think it's going to have to be a longer range. Again, I don't want to say rebuild, but I think like rethink of how they're doing things there. And they might have to make a difficult decision. Maybe they're trading a little bit more of a core type of player to get something. Like, I think it's going to be how they attack this is certainly why we're going to keep talking with the Predators. I don't think they've got there in terms of what the game plan is and what that's going to look like.
Just very intrigued about what that next move could be. I mean, you would hope that it doesn't result in, it's very early for a guy like Philip Tomasino, but he looks like he's fitting in just fine in Pittsburgh. It doesn't seem as if there've been that many concerns about Dante Fabro. And while it's very early for a guy like Yaroslav Askarov, like still risky to move on from such a young goaltending prospect, even if you do have UC Saros.
They own 3 first-round picks in this draft.
That's true.
So let's not forget they have some ammo, I would say, to do something interesting. It's just probably going to take a little while. That's kind of what I'm winking at. I think they're a big time candidate to make a big trade at some point. I don't think that they're quite there yet in terms of pulling off that kind of deal.
Okay, I think we've done enough. We've gone through a lot of news. It felt like drinking from a fire hose today with all the content that we've had to go through. We don't normally do just full news shows like this, but we had to. We had to delve in.
We don't get many weeks like this. Let's when the well is full, drink, my
Especially
friend.
Now. Oh yes, for sure. Thanks so much for tapping in, everybody. Whether you were watching us on YouTube or listening over whatever podcast place you like to listen to our podcast. We'll be back in a couple of days with more great content, and make sure to follow us on the socials and subscribe to our podcast if you haven't done so already. CJ, great work as always.
Thanks, buddy. We'll see you on Thursday.
See you Thursday.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.